Okay. Can you hear me? Cool. Let's start in 3, 2, 1. So under the guise of huge economic benefits that they're claiming, which is also questionable on the part of the completely other debate, whether this growth is actually sustainable in creating a very non-healthy environment, which is doomed to fail, which is not necessarily this debate. We think Facebook, how do you say, Google, Amazon, and all of these companies have been avoiding scrutiny for so long, and the trend is that they're likely to continue, and it's going to be much harder for us to regulate them in the future as well. The problem is that currently, Facebook owns WhatsApp and Instagram and different multiple other companies that are to us are irrelevant but are relevant to other actors. Google owns YouTube, Android, Google platform. Amazon owns Twitch to some extent. So all of these are the thing that how do you say, determines to a large extent how people perceive the political sphere, how people perceive the democracy, what they actually engage with and see. Right? This is the huge power of it. They're the main controllers of what discourse is going to be. What am I going to see? And all these things, and the way that they're doing it is through algorithms and like how they're prioritizing and weighting different things in the search issue. This is a huge power that has tendency to sway elections. And this is why most of the things and most of the how do you say campaigning is currently happening actually online in these platforms rather than traditional television and traditional rallies, because the battle is who can get the best out of these algorithms in this search issue. The problem is this creates a perverse incentive for politicians, which I'm going to go to in a second. But let's talk about 1 second about how does this play out, how do these things, companies break up. We believe that the most logical breakup would be breaking them up on the individual, how do you say, companies, which means that Facebook cannot now own both WhatsApp and Instagram. It can only be Facebook, it can only be Instagram, and it can only be WhatsApp, similar to YouTube and all of these companies, insofar that it happens. Insofar that some of these companies are not sustainable, we believe that's completely fine, because they might have to change their business model to some extent, but the majority of these companies are really large companies that, how do you say, would still be able to survive. If they are not, that shows that they're not necessarily market valuable as well in this association. Let's talk about how they avoid regulation. What is this perverse incentive that we're going to cover in this association? Notice that we have multiple hearings throughout past 10 years or more about Facebook, Google, how we're gonna regulate them and stuff. Facebook was grilled to the largest extent that it was possible. Still nothing happened, right? The largest thing happened from actually Mark Zuckerberg willing and wanting to say, okay, maybe somebody should regulate us, not actually regulators passing a certain law which says that Facebook should do something about it. And it's becoming worse and worse. The problem is that the success of politicians is necessarily tied to their success on the platform, which means that pissing off Facebook and pissing off Google necessarily has implication on your electability in the first place. So then insofar that you want to bring up something like the threat of Google, threat to the conservative values which are not represented in majority of these platforms and all of these things, you're not necessarily able to do so, because you have to, even if you want to, you have to, how do you say, limit yourself to some extent, because you know that it's likely that their algorithms and the threat that they have is going to push you down. This is already manifesting the status quo with how they're interacting with, how do you see, Elizabeth Warren, for example, and her how she is portrayed in search results and in these algorithms, which is on the left, but even worse for the right wing. It's bound to get worse with more and more consolidation, because the trend of this is these companies, under the guise which opposition has to defend, which is no harm on the consumers, they still, how do you say, can consolidate, buy even more companies and buy any potential competitor that is valuable and relevant in combating this sphere. We believe this is a huge problem because it creates a huge perverse incentive. Again, notice Elizabeth Warren speaking out against this, and a lot of Silicon Valley people openly talking about how this is horrible. She wants to break us up. She wants to regulate us. This is going to have huge impacts on the economy. The problem is when people who you want to regulate have the ownership of how you're being perceived by the other individual, this is a huge threat that we cannot allow to face. What is the comparative? Which they might fairly say, but Facebook is still going to have this incentive. The problem is when you're so big that you're controlling 3 or 4 the most dominant platforms, the problem is in that sense, the competition is unlikely, right? If you own both Instagram and Facebook, which are the most likely where you're going to advertise yourself in this situation, it's much more likely for you to be excluded from this platform in the future, and to be excluded from campaigning and promoting yourself, which means less likelihood of winning election. This creates kind of a chilling effect on their side of the house, on what politicians are actually feeling it's reasonable to propose or not propose. So this is a huge threat to democracy in itself in this situation. This changes when these companies are weaker, because their argument, and their main dominant argument, is we're so huge, we're so important for this economy and all of these things, which is again kind of bullshit given how much money they're wasting, how much money they're losing, and how much industries they're actually killing with their bursting. Like look at Amazon in this situation. The problem is the control over the narrative, the control of how people perceive, is this actually something that we can or cannot do, is heavily influenced by these platforms that we need to how do you say, tackle in this situation in terms of their ability to have algorithms. But also it's about security risks to some extent, right? In a sense that, how do you say, you already solved horrible and huge problems of these companies not being able to completely control what is happening here. And avoiding regulation in that sense actually leads to stuff like embarrassment of Russia intervening in the US election, in the UK election, and being able to influence something that they should never be influenced. And a lot of these companies, like again, like imagine that on your platform 10 years ago or something, on your news media, how do you say, your platform led to Russians interfering, that would be a scandal. But here they just got a slap on the wrist and nothing happened. Closing opposition, yes.
Is it only Google, Facebook, and Amazon? Is there any line? Is there a committee? How is this process being made? And how do you break up Amazon that hasn't bought Instagram or WhatsApp? Like, what's the mechanism of your case?
Like, the problem is, like, when they come to the threat of the democracy, we can have a committee that is going to determine which parts and how much is too much to some extent, obviously, to some extent. Currently, as I said, like Google and Facebook quite fit this narrative, but also Twitch ownership by Amazon is also like owning one of the largest platforms. One of the largest platforms is also quite a problem, right? But also huge amounts of data that you have on the population, right? In terms of especially like politicians and what you can leverage against them when they know how much they have and what did you say on the platform, what is your private things. But also in terms of how people are feeling about these companies, in terms of like how exploitable they are, given that Facebook knows so much about you that they can micro-target your insecurities and instabilities in your life in order to promote their message and to promote the fact that they shouldn't be broken out. And this is a crazy idea from the left wing, or like far left wings or far right people who are pissed about conservatism or are economically unsavvy. So they play both roles. They're basically controlling the platform that gets people elected or not elected, which is a huge problem, which, how do you say, makes this an unsustainable and horrible model. And that's why you should vote open in government. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to call upon the first speaker.
Sorry, like Tin is having connection issues. He'll be back in literally 3 seconds. It kicked him out of the call.
Okay, when you are ready.
Can anyone hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Yep, your screen has frozen, but that's fine.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening up Teams. They miss. Can you at least hear me?
Okay, good. So we all have the same problem. Can you try and log out and log back in, or switch on a phone?
Yeah, he's turning on.
It might help if we all turn off our videos. Sometimes that helps with connection, so we can do that.
Do people hear me now? Do people hear me now? Okay, is it okay now? There should be no more echo now.
Can you just talk for about 10 seconds just to make sure? It seems fine, but just double check.
I'm saying things now. Do you hear me say? I'm saying things now. Do you hear me say?
Yep, that works for me. Everyone can hear him? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2. Opening government seems to make a very compelling case. However, they miss a lot of very important things. I'm going to explain what those things are before moving on. A lot of the problems that Milos describes are tied to the way in which Facebook's business model works and therefore how it tailors the information that you see during the electoral process. However, in no part during the opening government case was it clear how, in particular, do they change the business model of the companies that they break up. The business model of all of these platforms, Facebook, Google, and so on and so forth, is one, to collect and sell metadata to other companies, which then produce targeted advertisement, and two, to produce targeted advertisement themselves. The subscription-based model has died off a decade ago, primarily because it's less profitable in terms of market competition, because it means there's an entry fee and entry barrier for a large amount of people who need to pay a monthly subscription and so on and so forth to be able to access a service. Providing a free service is something that everyone essentially does, therefore it's very unlikely that you're going to revert to another kind of business model. Doing that is outside of the fiat opening government has within this debate. The reason why that's very important is because Facebook is not directly tailoring the content you see. It's not Mark Zuckerberg choosing the news that you're going to see. It's the algorithm impersonally collecting data, cross-referencing it to patterns of behavior, and then showing you this. To the extent to which the business model stays the same, the benefits of opening government are marginal. Note also that things like advertising space, both on the internet, on television, media, are still a zero-sum game. So the extent to which large amounts of candidates, like for example, Hillary Clinton, have access to things like super PACs, while Bernie Sanders doesn't, there is still quite a huge discrepancy in terms of how competitive elections are. So we are unsure how much of a delta is there. But the delta is even smaller when you take into account that these platforms are actually responding to popular criticism. Note that Mark Zuckerberg has actively started responding to the need for fact-checking, and Facebook is foolproofing the information that it posts, because you have independent verifiers that like post the tick sign if it's from actually a verified source, because they fear scandals, right? Because scandals deplete the value of their stocks, which hurts their shareholders. Because note that the value of shares and stocks is largely dependent on the confidence in the company. The confidence drops to the point you do not respond to popular criticism. So we said the delta on their side is even smaller, but no, delta is even smaller because they're likely to create an oligopoly. These are companies worth billions and billions of dollars. Even if you break them up, they're worth somewhat less billions of dollars. However, they still have an incentive to do the same thing that they were doing now. They still have enough money to run their business model. They still have an incentive to cartelize and lobby for the same regulation, right? Because that allows them to go through unchecked. And it's also very likely that over time, one of them is going to become stronger on the market and simply be able to buy off more market shares. And Milos can respond, we'll have more antitrust laws. Hasn't stopped them so far. Note, he doesn't have fiat in this debate to break them up indefinitely. He has the fiat to pass the motion. But in the future, he would have to show why he has the political capital to consistently intervene in the market that reproduces these trusts over and over again, which means you're unlikely to be able to pass that in any Western government which is pro-market anyway. But note the alternative, because this debate can only happen in countries where there is a democratic process. Note this probably doesn't include places like China. So the alternative is startups that produce things like end-to-end encryption, which actually make our privacy and our communication safeguarded on WhatsApp, being bought by Huawei or Alibaba rather than Amazon, who is likely to develop that technology because that technology is marketable in the West and is likely to be used by Facebook and other platforms to promote themselves as being places that safeguard privacy. This means like Alibaba can use the synergy effects of the Chinese Communist Party because it's directly tied and its CEOs are members of the party to be more efficient in terms of taking hold of the market, and Amazon has less of a hold in it, but also do the things it does now and like use the added share it now has to buy off like startups in Vietnam and shut them down. So this means that consumers in the West essentially have less goods to choose from. So the alternative in terms of social media is probably Weibo and things like that, which are controlled by the Chinese government and so on and so forth. So the alternative is likely to be just as bad as Milos describes, but with less scrutiny. So now that I've described that Milos doesn't have a comparative, let's talk about the idea of democracy. And this also directly clashes with OG. Couple of things to say here. First of all, these companies are already subject to the democratic process because they were vetted by consumers, right? Monopolies do not happen naturally. Most of these started in fucking garages. They happen because consumers chose to trade off some of their privacy knowingly, literally like opting into terms and agreements and stuff like this in order to have access to communication, to have access to business opportunities and ventures and connections. Which is a trade-off like any other you make in democracy. Very often we do trade off our freedom for security, note what we're doing currently during COVID. But secondly, we see this algorithm is probably the most correct way to get a democratic decision. Most people are in echo chambers because our families, the things we read, the colleges we go to, the morals we do not want to break, essentially placed on one side of the ideological spectrum, and most people are unlikely to move to the other side. So echo chambers exist anyway. What the algorithm does at least is provide you the greatest amount of information on your own views and beliefs. It clashes different candidates within your ideological spectrum. It produces discussions within comment sections on a specific idea or policy. It produces things like policy reports, and at the end of the day, it was you who chose the algorithm because you are knowingly clicking on that content. If I wanted to vote conservative, I would have Googled Tory party, and then the algorithm would have shown something different. But at least now, within the part of the spectrum I'm unlikely to change anyway, I get more information. This information is necessary because voting in elections, as opening government says, is the only way we actually get to control the state and therefore our destiny. Before I move on, I'll take closing government very quickly.
Given terms and conditions, given monopolies existing, are you seriously suggesting that people have meaningful consent here?
Well, one, yes. Two, even if not, we said this is uncomparative for reasons I described earlier. So we have an even if answer to this. Two more points. One, we said very often these companies being too big to fail gives them an investment cushion, which actually enables them to provide things for free. The reason why things like Google Maps are free is because Google has no competition, which means it has a contingency fund that does not have to be saved for like market externalities and competitors arising, which allows them to actually develop risky projects and provide these projects free of charge, which make our lives easier on a day-to-day basis. This is why like Elon Musk does the same thing. That's less likely to happen when you create more competition in the market. Less. As a government, when you do this, specifically because you do this for political reasons, like you say, this company threatens my politics. This means that you show yourself as a country to be incredibly unpredictable and incredibly interventionist. Therefore, the political risk assessment for a country is likely to be very low and you're going to be portrayed as insecure for investments. This means you get less investment, but also current investments are less likely to expand their business, less likely to expand into your market, which means less goods and less jobs for your people. But also, if you're seen as an interventionist government, you are less likely to get loans and assets on the financial market. And if you do, you get them at higher interest rates to compensate for the risk of you being a government who, for political reasons, stifles free trade, which is bad for most of the people. Everything else is uncomparative. Opening the opposition wins.
That speech, I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the opposition.
Cool. Am I audible? I hope so. All right. Just give me a sec. All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I think OG has already kicked themselves out of this debate based on how they do not fulfill their own base assumptions. The first one is if they value the metric of democracy so well, I think their burden is also to prove why their metric would be more fulfilled once you actually deprive people of all the useful information that they actually have, that they have implicitly consented into based on their preferences, which is, as far as I know, the base of democracy. Siamko does not give a line of response to that. I think it's going to be very easy to kick them out. So I'm first going to deal with that and deep in the content that Tino already brings to you. What are the large harms that you have on the comparative when everything the government can come up with in this debate is largely uncomparative and non-existent? So the first thing that they do not respond to is the idea that they say, and this is the context that Miloš brings, that it's much harder to regulate this company. It's going to be much harder to regulate in the future because they're already so powerful. Look, I think this is just an assumption that sounds intuitive, but it's completely incorrect. Even now, the biggest actors on the market are not untouchable and will always be able to regulate, but because of their incentives, that they're always not, you didn't have an obligation towards the state, but you perceive yourself the obligation information towards the people that are your consumers. So what does this mean when Tim tells you, oh, but Facebook, cares about his shares, right? The reason why Facebook cares about his shares, because a few years ago when Facebook was still one of the biggest companies in the world, they were posting content that was perceived as to be, like offensive or some terrorist that people did not respond to well, and people complained. They reported so much content that Facebook lost $1 million in shares in literally a few days. They completely blocked all of that content immediately, even though they were the biggest powerful company of the market, because they always want to keep this perception they're going to be stable, that people are still going to be coming to them. They're going to become the most powerful, not just one of the most powerful. There is always the incentive of these companies, right? Even if you're looking at Netflix or Amazon or any of the companies that are sort of monopoles on their market, they're still very accountable to their consumers because they want to be perceived like, I have the best content, I have the best shows, or even though I'm the biggest Amazon company here, you want to trade with me, you want to buy my stuff, right? So this is the incentive that is still going to happen. I'm not sure why this is just somehow disappears and is never going to be able to regulate, something that OG never actually explains. Secondly, they tell you that they work on basic algorithms, and then once you break them up, something is going to happen. If you have the fiat to break up the companies, I think we have the fiat to say we would make them disclose the algorithms if you so much care about your algorithms that are problematic, which we do not agree necessarily, but fine. Secondly, you already have that program that literally all of the companies use, right, and have traded to maximize consumer rights. Even TikTok, that is a Chinese company, has the same algorithms that all the other companies have because they have the same incentive in mind. What does this mean? This means if you break Facebook to Facebook and Instagram and something else, you will have all of these algorithms still, because they were made to maximize the profit of companies who paid for ad space. And you want them to be seen as though the viewers that were on your platform clicked on these views, and you were the ones who provided these companies with profit, right? I think that this means that the algorithms are still going to exist, even though we have smaller companies, because they still want to earn money from ad space or companies that are operating on there. So I think that is a word they never respond to. Very, very cool. Then they say, oh, but look, even if you take out all these algorithms, I think OG defeats their own purpose to feel democratic metric. Why? Because when I turn on Facebook and I click and I watch something, I do it because I like it. It literally measures how long you view a certain video, how much you interact with certain topics, right? Which means if I see something of a left-wing content, something about LGBTQ people, and I like that and I leave positive review, this is something, these are the companies or like sites that I go to often, this is going to happen again. But this is literally following my preferences that are implicit. I never voted on them, but it's very, very obvious that we always get the content that we actually want, right? And secondly, these monopoles were the product of implicit democracy. We use them because we want to, we inform them because we want to, and they ban the newspapers or basic TV programs that are losing viewers. And yes, closing government. I can buy a paper for a few quids if I wanted to, but probably don't want to, because I can find the same info the Guardian shares on the internet I find in these papers, but I obviously get more information on these platforms. To the extent to which closing government is true, and I have to press terms and conditions and we are coerced, everything in life is imposed on us. Then I ask closing government, should we not provide people with schools and education, because in today's society you have to go to school to succeed, and that somehow coercive, we didn't have a choice? I think this is stupid, right? Lastly, I think the biggest harm here is that you take out all on the government side, you take out information for people that they have communicated that they wanted. If they cannot engage with the content, they do not have the information to literally realize why they have certain stances, why they do, how they're going to communicate, literally what parties, NGOs they're going to engage with. You're taking away this information. If you take away the algorithms that you so much find harmful, we can have them on our side as well. I think governments are out. What does Tim tell you that is not responded to? And why is this crucial? Because you change the perception on the market is going to be largely, well, fucked up in the end. Because investments are screwed on your side because you're confident on the market becomes weaker. When the state will decide to intervene, you literally have no idea what happens on their side. You need to be perceived as a valuable investment. This means you're less likely to get loans, or if you get them, it will be tougher on the interest rate, which is uniquely harmful because you obviously as a company need money for savings and long-term projections, or to literally be less exposed to shocks on the market when they happen, right? Also, harmful, even upcoming successful new companies on those markets who could become competitive and profitable, just like Twitter is, but investors and shareholders will be less inclined to put funding and long-term trust because the perception is you're an interventionist government. The reason why this is also problematic is that now these investors have a large risk of not getting a return on their investments, because in these companies, you never know, oh, I invested something that it seems to be profitable. If they turn out to be too successful, it means they're going to get broken up or going to lose their algorithms, whatever government wants, right? Also probably imposing higher interest rates, which is also largely harmful to your own citizen because it's the money you're losing on the comparative, right? Like, and we free of charge use all of these things because they are these two big companies, but we, like, people still use it. I'll take closing government. Yes.
Your case kind of seems to be like monopolies are really good and market efficiency. Do you like even support existing antitrust laws?
Yes, exactly. But this is on the comparative, right? Because we support when they're actually harming people and prices, and the market tries to literally have it in the motion what the comparative is. This is the debate about if they're not literally breaking or harming their consumers, what do we do with them? And is the monopoly in of itself good or not when it comes to sharing information? We literally prove to you in 40 minutes that it actually is, right? But if you do it, you have all of these harms that are largely terrible for your market, right? And I think this is good because when they are too big, we have all these benefits. We can use this fucking Zoom shit for free to navigate our life or help us ourselves in the every time, right? I think this is uniquely good. The comparative, obvious enough, is if they're breaking our rights, if the prices are too low or too high, or people cannot compete, we obviously attack them. That is the comparative. And also, when Janko says the big ones will still be powerful, he concedes that they will still be strong on their side. This means they will still lobby on your side and harm the democracy however they like opening government, which means Janko literally concedes that all of their benefits are marginal. At the end of the day, I think governments are already washed out in, and I prove to you the most harmful things for the market literally harm the citizens that are living complete fine lives with these companies that are not harming them or the market. Please vote opening opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the third speaker.
You hear me okay? We're going to win this debate in two ways. The first and most simple way is to prove that this is in fact a principally legitimate policy and is likely to curtail democracy, because almost all of OO's material is to say these are and do have democratic use. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to weaponize OO's material against them and prove why it is that tech companies are likely to respond to this imminent threat by imposing their own regulations in ways that are very tangible, very fungible, and are likely to erase all of the problems OG has an issue with, but without having all of the harms that OO talk about. First, principle, why is this legitimate? Weird that opening government don't talk about this, because without it, the building blocks of their case don't make sense, because they are necessarily doing a massive incursion on people's freedoms without legitimacy. The first thing to establish is that the purpose of consumer welfare as the existing test of monopolies is to say that it would unfairly limit the choices available to consumers. That is to say that consumers and the average person has a right to a diverse range of options. And notably, we also recognize that through other norms, for instance, the prohibition of false and deceptive advertising. The second layer here is then to suggest that when an institution reaches a threshold such that its behaviors actively curtail that choice, we ought to intervene. And notably here, the choice we're talking about in our case is actually much more extreme than the case that currently exists with respect to other forms of market manipulation. Because if you can't buy a product because it's too expensive, that is bad. But if a country comes to be and exist in a way that you did not choose and like your choice is curtailed such that you elect someone you otherwise would not have elected, and your country is manifestly worse, then that is a far, far more substantial harm and a far, far greater infringement upon your personal choice. The third thing to establish then is how then do these two tests we've established apply here. The first thing to say is that this literally is the debate. So when opening opposition says, oh, well, this thing might not be infringing democracy, cool. That's not when we're going to intervene. Our test is, as the motion says, where they do infringe upon democracy. But notably here, as I said, the test here does apply because you've distorted the individual's capacity to make the decision based on the information you presented them with, the information you excluded from presenting them with, and the way in which you presented that information. OO says a few things here which I'm going to address, but otherwise that principle stands, and that guarantees that this is a legitimate policy. The first claim from OO is super PACs exist. 3 things to say in response. First, yes, those things do exist and they weaponize social media far more aggressively. Second, we would prefer to dissolve those things too, and we think that this policy creates movement towards getting rid of other things that are counterproductive like that. But thirdly, note that this is actually far worse because like regulation can apply far, far more so to a far more tangible and traditional platform. Sorry, the fourth thing to say is that at the very least, it is more explicit when you engage with those super PACs and the advertising they present you with. They then say that you opt into these things. 4 responses. First, you don't really opt into it because people don't properly understand and adhere to the information that they're doing when they sign up to these sorts of data agreements. Second, you also didn't consent to other people making those decisions in such a way that manifestly disprivileges you. So if you're the one person who doesn't have Facebook, you didn't consent to your democracy getting overthrown in this capacity. Third, we don't think people have sufficient foresight, and we often obviate contracts on this basis alone, which is to say that if people make decisions and that decision locks the country into a bad state, then that into the future future that they could not have adequately foreseen, that contract is invalid. Fourth, we tell you it is extremely difficult to opt out for all of the positive reasons that opening opposition gives you, such as people's lives being intrinsically linked to it. The last claim they make here is it's good for democracy, and you have, like LO says, you have debates on this platform. I think there's two things to say here. The first is it obviously doesn't align with reality. So for instance, look at Mark Zuckerberg's behavior and his refusal to mark fake news on that platform. But the second thing to say is that this actually seems structurally unlikely because it runs directly in tension with the incentive of these social media platforms, which is to say that Facebook has an incentive to make you happy, to show you news that you like, to make you feel a sense of community, and thus they promote material actively through the algorithm, which is material you are likely to like, rather than showing you things that are controversial and you are unlikely to engage with. That is the first prong of our extension. This is a legitimate policy. This was sufficiently bad for democracy. Let's now talk about a separate mechanism with respect to how this actually makes things substantially better. But before I do, I'll take closing opposition.
Who and how is going to determine if you were presented enough information about Republicans or weren't presented enough information about Democrats?
I understand your claim. This is like akin to saying, well, how would you ever break up a monopoly? Because often monopolies do have to engage with subjective tests. For instance, like current existing competition and consumer commissions, which exist in every single country in the world, deal with the subjective claims that you were describing. They have to determine artificial random price points such that that thing is now like no longer competitive. Yeah. So what you're saying is this is a hard thing to do. I agree. That's why we have a panel of independent experts who are going to do that. I think you're going to have to come up with more than just saying this is a hard thing to do. We have the fiat to do this policy and to do this policy well. That's how debating works. Let's now talk about our separate mechanism. We tell you that this is a proactive and that would lead to proactive and self-administered reform. The first thing to note here is that this actually co-opts OO's own analysis when they say people complain as shareholders. The first thing to establish is that companies take very seriously the fear of being broken up. That is for two reasons and occurs in two separate mechanisms. The first is that shareholders push upwards, lobbying through annual general meetings and other forms of general meeting such that they do not wish to incur that cost. That is because that would substantially devalue their share of ownership in that country, and an additional IPO of a separate part of that company, like say Instagram, would necessarily have a very high level of risk attached to it. The second thing to say is that executives and board directors also don't want to lose their jobs and don't want to lose and devalue their stock options as they exist. What effects does that therefore have? The first is that tech companies actively try to prove that they're complying with democracy and democratic effects. And notably here, they err on the side of caution and are unlikely to contravene that or do any of the harms that opening government talk about, like try and manipulate the political process, lest they incur this massive unfortunate error. Notably, this also puts pressure on social media companies to put that same pressure on others to ensure that one of them doesn't go too far, and that then leads to a harm for them. So now Jack Dorsey of Twitter has an incentive to actively call out Facebook and say, don't do this, rather than the sort of like unofficial cartel behavior that exists at the moment. Notably then, that means that the failure thus far for any social media companies to actually do anything, like Mark Zuckerberg's refusal to label fake news, actually changes in an organic way such that they really do not want to reach a certain threshold of behavior. OO says a few things here. The first thing they say is that people complain and that thus this loses share values. We agree with the broad mechanism here, but think it works far more effectively on our side because of all the reasons I've given you. But 4 additional responses. The first is by their logic, there would be no unethical corporations at all. The second is to say that this is a good reason to do surface level reform, but that doesn't suffice in our world because you have a far, far greater degree of scrutiny and can't get away with a quick PR campaign. The third thing to say is that social media has a monopoly on the platform of dissent, meaning that it's very easy for Facebook to make it very hard for you to actively criticize them and thus affect their share price. And the fourth thing to say is that shareholders make trade-offs. So if it is a substantial curtailment of my enormous power as a Facebook shareholder versus, a little bit of temporary bad publicity, they're likely to choose the former rather than the latter. We win this debate on 2 separate axes. We prove this is the only legitimate policy, but we also prove that this policy has a separate, far more effective mechanism than opening government. Proud to
Okay, thank you for that speech. I'd like to call upon the third speaker.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to do 2 main things. First of all, I'm going to show why splitting up a company into little companies is going to do worse for the democratic process. Then, secondly, I'm going to show why this is actually abusable in the sense that here the comparison that we have to make, unlike what we hear, is a more objective criteria in which economists can determine and can do calculations that then can debate those calculations. And here you cannot tell me that 1 and 1 is not 2, versus asking the narrative question of, am I harming democracy, in which way, how, and so on. Because here, notice already from the get-go that the ideas that we get about democracy is harmed and so on appeals to every kind of newspaper or platform of discourse. Notice that whenever someone makes any decision on something to publish, what not to publish, which money to take in terms of advertisement, this is a choice that can influence democracy. However, we didn't think that in the age, even before social media, where we had less competition between newspapers, that meant that newspapers are harming democracy. Also notice that other countries trying to influence other countries also existed before the social media area, in which you had real attempts to try and divert politicians, to influence culture, and so on. I don't understand what's the major difference, considering that discourse can be swayed one way or the other. But notice that in reality, we already have a lot of those debates exactly on the type of questions that CG care about, in towards how much censorship I apply. The entire discourse, the entire controversy of Twitter versus Facebook is on the question of, do I publish alt-right people? Do I publish Trump? And so on. This at least means that there is a competition in the sense of who gets to say what. And secondly, I'm not sure what are even the things that are being censored. I mean, on the one hand, they tell us fake news is bad, but on the other hand, they say publish all. So it seems like they don't really have a quite clear mechanism as to what this means. And basically, they have a problem with the fact that they don't know what an algorithm does, which doesn't then seem to impact democracy that much. Moreover, notice that this once again doesn't apply to Amazon, I don't know how Twitch has to do with this, and so on. But then the second thing is, if we can have this understanding of we need 35% Republican ideas, why not have this regulation? Why break up an entire company if you yourself know what can constitute a good democracy in the sense of freedom of speech? I don't understand that. Thirdly, they say, oh, companies are going to create their own regulation. But notice that according to the mechanism of opening government, the only thing that they can do to regulate themselves, according to this, is to drop Instagram. Notice that this is not something that they get on their side to redefine the mechanism as towards what type of regulation they're going to do. But moreover, we are seeing that regulation now, and I'll go on to that in my point. So what are then the reasons that breaking up to smaller companies is worse? The first one is that if you now are a smaller company, you have less of an ability to make a profit with the data you have, considering that it's not enough and that competition is so intense. This means that more and more companies are going to sell to third parties their information because they don't have the ability to aggregate enough or to be a big enough platform in order to advertise only for themselves and see a profit. This exactly means that you have Cambridge Analytica all over again, something that we don't see right now that Facebook did when it was smaller. And now we're going to have more and more companies that are less accountable, that are more in the shadows, that you have to sign the terms and conditions agreement in order for you to get Facebook separately from Instagram. And now they're going to use this information in a way that can be much more dangerous. This is also something that brings out more foreign interference. This is exactly the kind of thing that allows foreign companies to compete with you in a much better level. And this is exactly the kind of thing that prevents Microsoft from ever wanting to buy TikTok in order to try and save American interest, because exactly they are afraid that they would be a danger to the democratic process, that they would have the entire market to themselves, and so on. But here, what you are creating is actually more room for more companies that are not as accountable to you. Also, we say that it's good to have one or less people that are accountable to the government, even in terms of regulation. We would rather have one Mark Zuckerberg that everyone knows, that even though we may not change immediately everything that Facebook does, we do think the changes are incremental in the sense that the public knows who this person is and they have the ability to demand more and more and even have personal campaigns. Also, it's easier if you as a Congress can have Mark Zuckerberg answer, unlike a lot of smaller people that can't really say anything, and they would say, okay, that's just the market as it works, and so on. And here it's really hard then to determine or to have enough traction in order to show that you are doing things to safeguard the public, which is a good thing. Also, we say lobbying can exist on both sides, and if you have more companies to lobby, they can lobby more and more parties, because lobbying is mutually exclusive. If you are one company, you can lobby one party. If you are more, you can actually gang up on more politicians. Now, before I continue, OG, yes.
Okay, Monica. We need to decentralize power in these conglomerates to create system of check and balances in between each other, because they will necessarily have completely different interests.
Okay,
that's why we're
Janko,
breaking them up.
But the different interests are still to make money. And this is the kind of thing that would go against the consumer. And you didn't show why things are improving in your speech. You just wished it to be. Then let's talk about the idea of abuse. Because notice that no definition that we get can be precise. We think that while numbers, although CG claim are subjective, are less subjective than anything else and can be scrutinized in courts, can be scrutinized by companies, and companies know what they are expecting. This, however, can be used by politicians like Trump to say, Twitter is going after democracy, and notice that they can even get chunks of the public to agree with that, to go use populism in order to convince that democracy is indeed in danger due to those. Now, we say that regulation can have mistakes, but at least you can turn it back. If you break up a company, that's it. There is no reuniting a company, meaning that the price of making a mistake is way worse, in the sense that now you can crush a company that is in opposition to a government or to another company without the ability for them to defend themselves and without the ability for them to change back things to what they use. We think that this is highly undemocratic, and we call you to oppose.
Thank you. That speech, I could call upon the final speaker for.
1 sec, sorry. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to look at quite a few things in this speech. I'm going to deal with the CO extension. Then I'm going to look at how we actually get reform on our side, why we think this is justified, and then if I get time, dealing with some miscellaneous front half claims. So look, I'm a little bit confused about what the CO extension is, but I'm going to give it a go. I think their first idea is this thing that it's easier to focus all of your energy on one person rather than multiple people. I think that's just a little bit silly, right? Because like, despite the fact that that exists in the status quo, and we've tried to do that with Mark Zuckerberg, it obviously hasn't worked given how like a powerful Facebook continues to be. That also though ignored Seamus's mechanism, which is that at the point in which you have incentives to reform within your industry, even if there are multiple of you within your industry, you have incentives to pressure for regulation because you don't want the whole industry to be regulated further as a result of like one bad apple, so to speak. So, but yeah, I just think it's kind of weird that like, obviously if you're so powerful, more scrutiny on you individually doesn't really make sense. Then they kind of say more stuff which sounds very similar to their opening around why you would get more investment in like less democratic perhaps companies. But I think there are just multiple reasons why there are still plenty of incentives to invest in these companies. Like, they're not financially desolate, they still offer a profit, and some people would probably prefer to invest in Western countries to the extent that on the comparative, obviously we say that, you know, they're bad if they're distorting the democratic process, but it might still be preferable to invest in them to the extent that they are less bad than, you know, companies that are run by China. So there seems to be just like still a lot of reasons why you would invest. The last thing that they say is that, you know, bad actors like Trump could weaponize this to say, you know, they're distorting that process. I mean, they can already kind of do that now, but also this allows like good actors to also co-opt this rhetoric and say, and point to the fact that rightfully so, there are distortions of the democratic process that tend to favor parties like Trump. But at the end of this premise, like the bulk of CEO's premise just seems to be, again, this idea that this can't be implemented well. I think Seamus answered this in his speech, where he explained that it would be fairly easy, you'd be able to do this quite easily for the reason that, again, you just have some sort of independent panel and they would look to things like your size, what sort of policies that you're doing. And Seamus observed that this is no different to existing antitrust law, where you do have to somehow, like sometimes make a set of somewhat subjective decisions. For example, when deciding what is in the consumer welfare, you might have to weigh up whether it's better to have a monopoly that has an economy of scale versus like whether they're likely to unilaterally raise prices. So those people make those decisions all the time. I think structurally they're likely to make these decisions well for the reason that there's, again, like lots of public scrutiny, there's lots of academic literature on these things, and they have an incentive to do this well, because obviously if they don't, they will be critiqued. So I think that fairly nicely deals with CEO's extension. Before I move on to other clashes in this debate, though, I will take a POI from OO.
At the point where government bench concedes that there's going to be a multi-billion oligopoly, lobbying still exists. Therefore, the average citizen has marginal influence on legislation. What algorithms then do and cannot do if they are removed is allow wide societal accessibility to alternative candidates like Bernie or AOC actually propose alternative policies. This is what you have to deal with on your side. It's imperfect, but does things.
Look, I don't really understand that, right? I think, okay, so I think my next part of this case will kind of implicitly address that, which is how we get change, right? Because to some extent we do agree with OO that being smaller doesn't necessarily mean you will always reform. You may not change your business model. But what Seamus uniquely brings to you in extension is this idea that if you want to avoid being broken up, as many companies do, you have incentives to reform internally and point to politicians, to the public, the fact that you have made these reforms. And you're also, as I said earlier, likely to do that within your industry, such that, you know, if one person in your industry is doing something bad, you have an incentive to kind of discuss norms of that industry with them, such that you're not regulated as a whole. CEO's kind of only response is really just to say, oh, but like, what are you going to do, right? Like, I mean, I encourage you to use your imagination, right? There are a multitude of things that companies could do to reform. They could, for example, be more, you know, honest about their algorithms, something that OO supports in this debate. They could just be, you know, they could be more receptive to, for example, supporting fact checking. Like there are a lot of things, guys. Use your imagination. So even if you do believe OO's harms, that there is some impact on you know, investment and whatnot, right? The reason we defeat that is because we prove that, again, I don't think that harm holds up, but even if you believe that, we're unlikely to get to that point because these companies will have the incentive to reform internally before that. And that is obviously a huge benefit, and I think puts us up above our opening, because it kind of resolves the deadlock of like, will they actually change their practices just by being smaller? We tell you that they do that. So let's look now at sort of the principle around consumer rights, because their main, OO's main push here is just that, you know, this is good for consumers. They have access to things that they otherwise wouldn't. Note that most of their material here seems to again be predicated on like a sort of economy of scale analysis. And again, I then find that confusing, because that would be a reason to oppose existing antitrust laws which exist. But even if you don't buy that, Seamus explains to you an additional principle, which is basically that it's a very narrow conception to just look at consumer rights beyond any other right? Because if democratic erosion like influences your ability to vote for your welfare, for literally everything else that is not consumer related, then obviously that is particularly substantial and something we should care about, right? So like maybe at best, OO proved that there is a consumer benefit, but they don't weigh this against every other benefit, which is like your ability to vote for your best welfare policy and all of those sorts of things. But I'd also say, and Seamus explains, that distortions of the democratic process can distort consumer benefits in the long term, because if a company becomes more powerful, they can do things like lobby better, and that can lead to distortions in price in the long term. So I think we win the principle here, because, and note that gets scant response at CO. The last thing is just some miscellaneous ideas. This idea that you're too scared to be successful in innovate, like this brings me back to like badly anti-painted arguments that were run in like 2012. Like people obviously still have incentives to invest, guys. Because, you know, you still make profit. Finally, on consent, I don't think I really need to do much with this, because Seamus provides a lot of reasons in response to the OO about why it is that you cannot meaningfully consent to a lot of these policies because of social pressure, because of dominant market forces. So at the end of this debate, I think we're the only team that uniquely provides a plausible mechanism, and why principally this is so important, and that's why we're very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. And to the final.
Can you hear me? Harish?
Yep, I can hear.
Okay. I don't know, am I cut off or something? Like, Harish, you're sort of cut off to me, so I'm thinking whether it's me or...
Can you hear me?
Yes, okay. So, 1 second. Great. So, 3, 2, 1, go. I'm going to talk about 3 things in my speech. First of all, what is not relevant to this debate? Second of all, what is this specific mechanism is doing to the effect on democracy that those companies have? And thirdly, how are those companies or politicians are going to respond to this measure, and why this response is much worse? The rebuttal will obviously be integrated. So first of all, what is not in this debate? 3 things in here. First of all of the economic arguments from OG, all the things about more competition, companies buying out other companies, there are not enough small startups and stuff like that. If OG thinks that those things are horrible, and if they think that those companies are doing those things, they should regulate against that and not against democracy. Probably there are other firms that are not Facebook that is doing this. Probably some of those firms are not doing this at much. They should have their measure target what they care about and not this motion specifically. This is just not relevant. Second of all, the economic reasons we got from OO as well. All of the things about people are not going to invest enough money. Like what we've already heard from people in this room, but is also quite conceivable, is that there are mechanisms already today to break up some companies. That means that the issues of predictability or investing in small companies is either symmetric or just not relevant, because most startups do not think that they are going to become the next Facebook. Therefore, their investors do not afraid that in 20 years from now, they're going to be broken apart. And Facebook has enough revenues, so it doesn't need the investors that will be afraid or stuff like that. We just don't know how it is relevant to this specific motion. The third thing that is not relevant is CG's mechanism of change. Why is that? Because the mechanism of OG within this debate was very clear. The problem was that those companies have too much influence over other things. They get data from different sources and they aggregate it and see how it affects many different people, which means that when this is defined in OG as the criteria to when you're going to break up those companies, that means that there are no things like that of chilling effect that those companies can do, because no matter what Facebook do, how transparent it is or whatever, it's still going to have information from aggregated sources. It's still going to control some different platforms, and therefore by OG's mechanism, it is not going to be not good enough for them. So we think that by this point, all of those things are really not relevant. Let's move on. What is this specific mechanism doing? Because 3 burdens on governments that they don't stand on, and therefore they lose this debate. First of all, they need to show us why regulation is not enough. They claim regulation has not been succeeded in the past, but this motion has a lot of fiat power. Probably with the same power, you can do other specific regulation things. It is like they're saying, we want more eco regulations on oil companies, so we should own all of the oil companies, just like get them to the government hands and have those regulations. Probably all of the managers of all of those companies would prefer those regulations to breaking up the company, and therefore it is possible. This also answers the CG point about officials that know when something harms democracy. If government think that there is a clear line of like, I need to show you 35% of Republicans think, and therefore I'm going to be balanced, I'm going to like show my algorithm or stuff like that, then regulate against that. If those things are very clear, you should regulate against them. You shouldn't punish companies that don't know what are the things that are going to be broken off. The second thing that government do not do and should do is saying why size is relevant to the amount of influence that those companies are going to have. And therefore breaking up is a relevant metric, because what are the things that we got from OG? They're going to say, now we will have less information, or they have those magical algorithms that can affect people's mind. But listen, Harish, probably if you only have Facebook, only have Instagram, only have Google, or only have YouTube, you still have enormous amount of information, enormous amount of effect on people, and enormous amount of breaking algorithms or something, which means that they should show us the delta that is being changed because of this motion. And we think that in debate, saying algorithms are magical is not a replacement of analysis. We think that having enough information and enough influence is probably bad enough. And therefore, this motion does not change, this specific mechanism does not change the bad things that are claiming that happens. The third thing, and the most important one, is that actually breaking up is going to reduce the amount of effect on democracy. O tells us different companies are still going to lobby, but Janko tells them, but they have conflicting interests and therefore they will fight each other. We've told you three things that are much more important than that. First of all, on the lobbying stuff, we've answered why it is different. First of all, because in many issues like privacy laws or being against Elizabeth Warren, as OG likes to talk about, all of those breakup companies have the same interest and therefore will lobby for the same things. But unlike showing that this is symmetric, as I've told you, we've shown you why it is worse, because now they can approach different politicians, fund all of them, and therefore have much more influence than what one company could have gotten. The second thing that we told you, and didn't get any response, was the fact that a lot of the damages, and the most important damages to democracy, comes from information that is leaking. And actually, when a company is big enough, it doesn't want to give its information to other people because this is how it makes money. But when it is smaller, it wants to aggregate more information. It wants to get more money because there is more competition and every dollar counts. And therefore, the chance that it will sell real data to Cambridge Analytica or to Russia or to China or whatever are much bigger, which means that all of the harms that OG are talking about are also bigger, and this is far more important than what we've talked about before. But thirdly, we think that the ability to do personal attacks on people is also more important. Before I move on to that, I will take CG.
Your only response to our entire mechanism is to say it contradicts OG, but OG's problem is not with all technology companies. We give series of tangible ways it fixes it.
Okay, we think that first of all, OG can define a mechanism that you should stand behind. Secondly, I've also answered that there is a clear cut, you should regulate it, not break up the company. So we've also talked about personal attacks, because we've told you that actually it does very effective. They tell us it doesn't work, and it's funny from a team that all of its cases is chilling effect. Facebook and Instagram has done fact checking. Google is being fined by $50 billion in the EU. Those things are working. So let's sum it up and actually compare it to what we got from OO. Because what did OO tell us? They've told us those algorithms show you different things, and therefore you might change your mind on different issues. We think that this is highly uncomparative to the fact that Facebook, Instagram, Google, or YouTube are going to exist in the next day. Therefore, we don't know how those things change. But the thing that we've talked about, the accountability, the leak of data, or the fact that the lobbyism is much more effective, is a huge delta that is far more important than the meaningless things that also happens when you read newspapers that OO talked about. Therefore, we think that we've showed you that the harms that comes from actually having this specific mechanism is much worse, and there are far better alternatives. And even if you don't do any alternative, probably the status quo is much, much better than doing those things. From all of those reasons, please oppose the motion. Thank you.